Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So today I'm wearing red. Today I'm wearing not just any red, but Marvel red, because today we are going to be discussing some Marvel films. And in honor of the release of Black Widow, I'm going to be going through my ranking of the Phase 1 films from the MCU, because of course Black Widow, aka Natasha Romanoff, was introduced into the MCU in a Phase 1 film. I'm super excited to be bringing you guys this video. This is somewhat of a continuation of a series of sorts on my channel, because I have already ranked Phase 3 of the MCU. I did that video like a couple of years ago at this point, so it is quite old, but it's still very valid. So if you want to check out my ranking of the Phase 3 films, you can do so now. Unfortunately, there are far fewer films in Phase 1 to get through, but that doesn't mean that they are any less important, because of course Phase 1 was the start of it all. These films started the entire MCU. These are the foundations upon which the MCU was built, and of course ultimately these films led to the entire transformation of the film industry in the last 15 years. So we're going to be going through my thoughts on all of these films and ranking them in order of my least favorite to my most. But before we delve into my thoughts, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. Now, without further ado, let's get into my ranking of the Phase 1 MCU movies. So right at the bottom of my list, at number 6, we have The Incredible Hulk. I've watched this movie. Like, I promise I've watched this movie at some point. Please don't ask me when. Please don't ask me when I've watched The Incredible Hulk. It's been a while, but I did watch it, I'm sure. I vaguely remember what happened in this film, I guess, but overall it was just very forgettable for me, okay? I know that it's a sticking point for Marvel Studios that The Incredible Hulk is still technically owned by Paramount, so they can't make any solo Hulk films, and that's why they've kind of kept The Incredible Hulk from 2008, I believe, or 2010, I can't remember, but that's why they've kept Ed Norton's Incredible Hulk as part of the MCU saga, because they won't be able to replace it anytime soon unless Paramount allows them to buy back the rights to that character. So I know that's a big sticking point and a lot of people are upset about that. I, for one, have never wanted a Hulk solo movie. I feel like he's the kind of character that works best with other characters, because for me it's difficult to be invested in this kind of huge hulking killing machine. And then you have the human side of him in Bruce Banner, which I think can kind of be delivered well alongside another character anyway, so I don't really see the point of following his story on his own, at least considering that we already have an Incredible Hulk movie, which I barely remember as it is. So yeah, I'm fine with just keeping things as they are. I'm sure I watched it at some point and found it to be pleasant. There aren't really any MCU films that I would say are god awful. Like, there aren't any bad MCU films in the scheme of like actual terrible cinema. There are just like forgettable films like this one. But in terms of my thoughts on The Incredible Hulk as a film, I have watched it. Like, I watched it at some point, okay? Can I remember what happens? No. Am I gonna rewatch the film to find out? Absolutely not. You guys can let me know what happens in that film down in the comments below. So next up, at number 5, we have Iron Man 2. Now this will come as a surprise to absolutely no one, especially if you're familiar with rankings of MCU films, because oftentimes these two films, The Incredible Hulk and Iron Man 2, are right at the bottom of everyone's list. And there's a reason for that. Iron Man 2 just simply wasn't a great installment in the MCU. Here we have the return of Tony Stark, aka Iron Man, and he's getting up to shenanigans, some playboy shenanigans, okay? He's messing around, not taking his role as Iron Man seriously, being the kind of showboat that he was previously in Iron Man 1. But at the same time, this film also seeks to delve into Tony Stark's past, and namely his relationship with his father, Howard Stark, and how it impacted him into his adulthood, considering the fact that his father and mother died decades earlier, and we find out, of course, in Captain America Civil War that was at the hands of Bucky Barnes, aka the Winter Soldier. He enjoys the kind of status and notoriety that comes with being Iron Man, but kind of loses the sense of responsibility that's supposed to come along with this title as well. Yeah, overall, I've never really felt compelled to return to this film time and time again, because here's the thing, fun fact about me, okay, and I've already mentioned this in other videos, so it's not some huge revelation, but I'm not the biggest Iron Man fan. Like, at all. Like, I'm not the biggest fan of Tony Stark. In the case of Iron Man 2, this is even further emphasized when you see all of the shenanigans and party boy antics that he gets up to in the film, and it makes him even less likable in my eyes. In the case of the other elements in this film, we do have the introduction or reintroduction of James Rhodes, aka Rhodey, who is now portrayed by Don Cheadle. Of course, Terrence Howard initially portrayed this character in the first Iron Man movie, but because of, you know, contract negotiations and other behind the scenes issues, he ended up leaving this role, and Don Cheadle picked it up, and he is now the Rhodey that we've come to know and love. And in this case, Rhodey is kind of this like military man, okay? He's very much involved in the military as a colonel, okay? He has a very high position, and he's now leading negotiations for military contracts with Hammer Industries, because of course Stark Industries previously held those contracts, but then Tony Stark decided to stop making weapons and instead focused on like renewable energy or something like that, based on his like arc reactor invention. And as a result, Rhodey has had to look elsewhere for those US military contracts, and he's landed on the lap of Hammer Industries, which of course brings us to the VIP of this whole film. The only thing that makes this film watchable, in my opinion, is Sam Rockwell's Justin Hammer. Absolutely, absolutely. Justin Hammer is an icon. Justin Hammer is a whole mood. I really want to see this character return in the MCU. Like, I think Sam Rockwell did an amazing job chewing up the scenery in his portrayal of this character. He was great. Okay, he's an icon. As I said, he's, I think, the best villain in the whole Iron Man franchise. Oh, actually, no, never mind. But he's one of the best villains in the whole Iron Man franchise, so I would really like to see him return, especially considering, of course, that Rhodey will be returning with his own Disney Plus series in Armor Wars, where they'll be discussing some of the themes that were actually touched on in Iron Man 2, the idea of other people getting a hold of advanced technology like the Stark tech that we saw Tony Stark developing in Iron Man 1 and 2, and how they would use that, like what happens when that level of technology lands in the wrong hands. We saw some of that at the beginning of Iron Man 2, as I said, with Justin Hammer himself creating prototypes that didn't quite work out, but a few years have passed now, like a whole decade has passed now, so we're gonna start to see how that technology has advanced in light of that, and I think it would be fitting for Sam Rockwell's Justin Hammer to return. And lastly, of course, when it comes to Iron Man 2, as I mentioned earlier, this film also introduces us to the character of Natasha Romanoff, or in this case she's referred to as Natalie because she's undercover. Okay, she's undercover, and at first she's like Tony Stark's assistant or something, his sexy assistant. And Scarlett Johansson has recently spoken about how, you know, heavily sexualized her character was in this film. Yes, her character is very overtly sexualized, just by the way that she's depicted before we even find out that she's the Black Widow. You know, the fact that all of the men surrounding her objectify her the minute she walks into the room, and even in the scenes where she's proven to be the badass, it's still through the male gaze. Like, she's the badass because she can wrap her legs around men's necks. Actually, before I forget, like I was actually going to completely forget to mention, the villain in this film is Whiplash. Apparently he's a combination of Crimson Dynamo and Whiplash from the comics, which is interesting because Crimson Dynamo actually gets a name drop in the Black Widow movie, but he's kind of forgettable. Like, I just remember him for his bird. Okay, he had an affection towards his bird, but other than that, like, You know, he was mad because Howard Stark did something. It's one of the rare occasions where the Iron Man villain wasn't mad at Tony specifically, but rather his father. So good for Tony, I guess. But otherwise, like, I wouldn't say he was a very memorable villain. So next up at number 4, we have Thor. Now, here's the thing. I have to make it clear that the jump between number 5 and 4 is substantial, okay? Because I personally really enjoy the first Thor film. I actually think it's quite good, like it's quite excellent. I personally feel like the only thing that kind of lets it down and puts it slightly lower on my list are the New Mexico scenes. They look so like average. There's nothing really investing or interesting about the backdrop to half of this story. And so yeah, I feel like the New Mexico scenes kind of let it down, especially in comparison to the scenes that take place in Asgard. But I really enjoyed Kenneth Branagh's kind of iteration of the story of Thor. The idea that he would put it under this kind of Shakespearean lens, give it the melodrama that it deserves. I think it's excellent. Of course, he has like a very storied background when it comes to the works of Shakespeare. I really do think it was an excellent interpretation of the story of Thor from the comics. But then you also have the incredible casting of Chris Hemsworth with the blonde brows. Unfortunately, with the blonde brows in this film. But then let's talk about Tom Hiddleston as Loki. Let's talk about Tom Hiddleston as Loki because my guy is an icon. Okay, there's a reason why he has his own Disney Plus series. Tom Hiddleston as Loki was chef's kiss. Genius. We have Anthony Hopkins as Odin, the worst absentee father in all history. We have Rene Russo portraying the character of Frigga. I mean, the whole cast is excellent. I would say the only weak point when it comes to casting would be Natalie Portman as Jane Foster. Not because she's not a competent and excellent actress, but because the role wasn't suited for her capabilities. Like, it really undermined her capabilities as an actress. Literally anyone could have portrayed the character of Jane Foster, so it was a mistake to get someone who ended up being an Academy Award winner. But anyways, I do feel like overall the casting is great. The portrayal of these characters is excellent. The melodrama, again, the relationship between these different family members, this royal family, where you have Loki being this outcast. He finds out that he's a whole different species. And at the same time, whilst this is happening, unfortunately, Thor's ego has grown exponentially. Like, he is focused on just slaying, taking down whole worlds, you know, subjugating people, as opposed to focusing on his skills as a leader, as a king, which Odin expects him to become one day. And so you have this really interesting conflict between the two brothers. Again, that is basically perpetuated by Odin himself and his absentee fatherhood. And it gets even better because he falls into the Odin sleep during this film. But yes, as I mentioned, one of the best parts of the first Thor film was giving us an insight into what space looks like in the MCU. Now, it's really interesting because there are kind of two different versions of space in the MCU. We have the kind of Guardians of the Galaxy space where it just feels kind of like kitschy and futuristic, but also kind of dystopian in a way. But then you also have, you know, the Thor Asgard version of space. Asgard just feels so much more grandiose and so much more regal than some of the other planets that we visit in, say, the Guardians of the Galaxy films. So it's interesting how they kind of divided the two different versions of space, at least the way that it's depicted in the MCU. But this was the first version that we got, and it was so exciting to see how the MCU would tackle the depiction of these stories that take place in space. But like I said, this story doesn't solely take place on Asgard. You do have elements of it taking place in New Mexico, where Thor is literally brought down a peg or two, where he is chucked out of Asgard because of his antics, and he lands himself in New Mexico, no longer worthy of his hammer. He no longer holds the power of Thor, and so he is greeted by Jane Foster and her gang. And Darcy actually makes a reappearance in another Disney Plus series, WandaVision, so she's also a character that seems to have lasted the test of time. But yes, Thor lands in New Mexico, and this film is all about his journey to try and regain the worthiness And in the end, Thor manages to learn the lessons that he needs to on the ground in order to pick that hammer back up and be worthy of becoming the future king of Asgard. So yes, the character goes through a really cool hero's journey, and in a lot of ways, even though I wasn't, you know, wholly invested in the scenes that took place in New Mexico, it makes sense that New Mexico would be so much more mundane than Asgard in order to really emphasize the differences between the two environments and really juxtapose them against each other. And next up, at number 3, we have Captain America, the First Avenger. Now, whilst I said that the space, I guess, between number 5 and 4 was quite large in terms of preference, there is a much smaller margin between number 4 and number 3 because I feel like they're kind of on par with one another. But the first Captain America film inches out the first Thor film just a little bit because it feels like it's more tight-knit. It feels like, you know, most of the scenes in this film are so critical and they move the story forward in such a productive way that there aren't really any dud scenes. And in the case of Thor, there are some scenes where it's like, okay, you know, we're just chilling around, where, you know, having some coffee, and yeah, the Another is really cool, it's really fun, it's really iconic, but there are a few scenes in that film that admittedly, like, if I was rewatching Thor, I would skip through them. But in the case of Captain America, which I did recently rewatch, every scene was important. Every single I really do think that the whole film is just so tight in terms of, you know, all of the scenes feeling crucial, having an impact and moving the story forward. But of course, we need to talk about Captain America himself before we delve into the rest of this film. He is here portrayed by Chris Evans, and this is his entry into the MCU, and just wow. Again, another case of perfect casting. Wow. A lot of us will know the story about how Chris Evans was kind of reluctant to be a part of the MCU because of those damn contracts, because of those like long-term contracts and the restraints that it would have on your career as an actor, because you're stuck in this role for like however many years and you can't really do anything else as these films are being pushed out. So like, I understand his hesitance, but make no mistake, becoming Captain America has been the best thing that he could have done for his career ever. But also it was the right decision for Marvel to cast him because he absolutely embodies Steve Rogers. He has the righteousness, okay? He has the kind of goody two-shoes-ness about him. The character of Steve Rogers is so like inherently good, and in a lot of ways it is tough to depict a character like that because there aren't really many directions that he can go in. There isn't a huge arc really for a character like that, which is in large contrast to say a Tony Stark, where he starts off like here being a trash human being, and then in the end he becomes like a hero. So that's like a nice arc that the character goes on, whereas in the case of Captain America, his arc is like a flat line because he was always a hero. He always had that hero spirit. We need to talk about the introduction of Bucky Barnes. Listen, we have that iconic scene where Bucky finds Steve in mess, as he always was apparently, in mess, getting into fights with people because, you know, some guy was making comments in a theater whilst there was this ad about the war, and Steve was like, you need to respect those soldiers, and so of course that guy beat him up in the back of the theater. And then you have Bucky coming in, okay, being this big man hero, Sebastian Stan portraying this character that would become so loved by Marvel fans. And of course Steve and Bucky form the biggest ship in the MCU amongst fans, Stucky, which, you know, whether or not you agree with it, it's a huge ship. Okay, and another beloved character that this film also introduced us to was of course Peggy Carter. Now I love the character of Peggy Carter. I love her pragmatism. I love how efficient she was. I love how she was able to see Steve and his potential even before he had the bod. Even before he had the body, okay? She was able to see him and see what he could achieve from the very beginning. However, as someone who did watch the Agent Carter TV series, okay, one of few people, unfortunately, I personally feel like the end of Avengers Endgame kind of undercut that series and the character arc that she went through there, because it was all about her trying to get over what happened with Steve and moving on in this new post-World War II world. The fact that Endgame kind of chucked her back in the same boat that she was in Captain America the First Avenger was unfortunate to me, but I already discussed this in my full review of Avengers Endgame, which you can can find on my channel. Anyways, but yes, I did enjoy the character of Peggy Carter quite a bit. I love the way that Hayley Atwell portrayed her. She obviously has that strength and again pragmatism and efficiency, but at the same time it's balanced out with genuine compassion and also relatability, especially to Steve, who knows what it's like to be undermined and written off by the establishment, by the military establishment. And so yeah, I do feel like their relationship and their romance that develops in this film is very believable and it's very compelling. I just feel like it shouldn't have lasted for like a whole 80, 90 years in Steve's brain. Like he should have gotten over it by then, just as Peggy did in the series. And in terms of the villain in Captain America: The First Avenger, we do of course have the Red Skull. I actually think that the Red Skull was an excellent villain. First of all, visually speaking, he's terrifying. Visually speaking, like he is an awful looking person because it's all of the ugliness, like all of the kind of the insidious parts of him are kind of manifested on his head. And I think it's a really interesting concept. It's something that Erskine kind of touches on. And by the way, he's portrayed by Stanley Tucci. Wow, Stanley Tucci's in the MCU. Anyways, so Erskine discusses this with Steve, where he's talking about how, you know, all of these ugly traits that the Red Skull had before he took the serum were kind of amplified. And this is a principle, of course, that becomes even more important in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I also enjoy the fact that the Red Skull is just unambiguously villainous. Like there's no nuance there. He's the bad guy. He's the worst of the Nazis. Like let's not forget, he was leading Hydra, which was the scientific division of the Nazis. So like he sucks, okay? And I love the fact that the film just leans into the fact that the Red Skull absolutely sucks. And finally, when it comes to my thoughts on Captain America: The First Avenger, I will just say that the score of this film is brilliant. And of course, it was no surprise when I looked up who was the composer that it's Alan Silvestri, who also went on to develop the Avengers score and theme. So yeah, I do feel like the music in this film is also beautiful and something worth noting. So next up at number 2, we have Iron Man 1. This is the film that started it all. This was the very first MCU movie, and at this point in time, no one, not even the all-seeing Kevin Feige, could have predicted how huge this franchise would have become. It's just incredible. It's just incredible to see what's become of the franchise since then, but I do feel like, again, Iron Man 1 holds up on its own. Now, of course, it's partially because of the incredible casting of Robert Downey Jr. as Tony Stark himself, the titular character. And a lot of us will already know the story of, you know, Robert Downey Jr. and where he was at in his career when he was cast for Iron Man 1, and how difficult it was to even get insurance for the actor because of the kind of turbulent personal issues that he had previously. But this role completely changed everything. It completely changed his life, it completely changed his career, and as a result, he's become one of the most iconic characters within the comic book movie space, and in fact one of the most iconic actors in like the whole decade. Like, let's be real, okay, in all of Hollywood. As I mentioned before, in large contrast to the character of Steve Rogers, Tony Stark does have a substantial character arc, especially throughout this film in particular, because of the place that he starts at, okay? When we're first introduced to the character of Tony Stark, he's talking about how, you know, peace will put him out of a job, okay? And I was actually reminded of that scene because I watched the What If trailer, which, by the way, so excited for What If, which is like right around the corner, surprisingly. But anyways, when I watched that trailer, I was reminded of just how much of a dickhead Tony Stark really was. And I already mentioned how, like, I'm not the biggest Tony Stark fan still, even after his little redemption arc, but I do feel like it's worth noting that at the beginning of this film, he starts off at a very low point. Similarly to Thor, actually. I feel like Captain America is the only one that starts off already a good guy, but because of how much of a dickhead Tony Stark really is in the beginning of the first Iron Man movie, it takes this horrendous act, it takes this horrific traumatizing event in order to completely change him, in order for him to do a complete 180 in his life. And that comes in the form of him being kidnapped by the 10 rings. Now, I don't know if this group is actually the 10 rings. It might have been a splinter group of the real 10 rings, because apparently they will be making an appearance in Shang-Chi. So I don't know what the relationship is there. They definitely come from the era of Hollywood filmmaking, where Hollywood was determined, Hollywood was committed to depict people from the Middle East as like the worst villains ever, as like the most unlikable, horrific people, because of the geopolitical circumstances of like the early 2000s. I do feel like it's interesting in hindsight seeing these villains, seeing the way that these Middle Eastern people are portrayed, but that was very much the norm back in those days, okay? But it takes that event, being kidnapped and just mistreated by these people to such an extent, for Tony Stark to completely change his ways. And I have to say, I think even to this day, that is one of the most traumatic things that have ever happened to any of these MCU characters. And I also feel like Iron Man 1 has one of the most emotionally impactful deaths in the entire MCU, in the form of Yinsen, the man that Tony Stark meets in that cave where he's trapped and kidnapped by the 10 rings. And he ended up helping Tony develop the first Iron Man suit that got him out, and he ended up sacrificing himself. And Tony was trying to get him to meet his family, but then he was like, I'm gonna meet my family anyway, because it turns out that his family had been killed. Cue the tears. Like, truly, every single time I watched that scene, I'm like, yes, like, he was such an incredible character. I felt so bad for him, and especially when you consider some of the other MCU kind of side characters that have died. Like in the case of Phil Coulson, I remember watching the first Avengers film, which we'll talk about my story of that in a second, but I remember watching that and being like, okay, like, Phil Coulson's dead, like, so what? Like, I actually didn't care. I actually felt so much more emotionally invested in Yinsen, so I feel like that was a really impactful death, and again, a really good driving force for Tony to completely change his ways. In terms of the other side characters in this film, as I mentioned, we have Rhodey, except this time around he's portrayed by Terrence Howard. I actually really liked Terrence Howard as Rhodey. I wish he'd just gotten it together and stayed in the films, although maybe wouldn't have gotten Lucius Lyon in Empire if he had stayed in the Iron Man films, like, maybe. So I guess it all worked out in the end, because Lucius Lyon is an iconic character. And of course we also have Happy Hogan, who is portrayed by the director of the film, Jon Favreau, and you know, he's a character, he's there. He's great, he's fine, he's, you know, he's there. And then you have Pepper Potts. Now, Pepper Potts is an interesting character. I could do a whole video on Pepper Potts, because I find it fascinating how Tony handed over the keys to his kingdom to his secretary just because he loved her. That's kind of nepotism. Like, let's think about it for a second. That's kind of nepotism. Was she qualified to head the whole of Stark Industries? No. Like, she was good at managing Tony. No one's going to take that away from her. She was good at managing Tony's affairs, and I'm sure she was involved in a ton of other things as Tony was busy partying, being the playboy that he was for like 20 years, okay? She was definitely holding down the fort, but to say that she was qualified to be like the CEO of Stark Industries, I'm going to question you on that one. And finally, when it comes to the villain, of course, we have Jeff Bridges portraying Obadiah Stane, aka Ironmonger, and this is one of those classic cases where the MCU villain is kind of like a direct reflection of the hero because they both have suits of armor that's developed from the same technology. I mean, we see this quite a few times in other subsequent MCU movies, but I do feel like what makes this stand out from some of the other instances where this happens is because of the close familial almost tie that Obadiah had with Tony. Like, he was supposed to be Tony's mentor. He was supposed to be Tony's kind of guardian ever since he lost his parents because of the Winter Soldier killing them. And so he was supposed to take over the company and help Tony run it, but instead, of course, he was looking out for himself and looking out for making, you know, double the profits by selling the weapons to both, you know, their side and also the other side of the war. And of course, Tony was too blackout drunk and high and too busy busy being the playboy that he was for like 20 years of his life to realize what Obadiah was doing to his own company until it was almost too late. And finally, much to the surprise of absolutely no one, like no one should be surprised by this, at number 1 we have the first Avengers movie. Now, fun fact, okay, about my entry into MCU fandom, this was actually the first MCU movie that I watched because I didn't know what Marvel was in 2013 when I watched the first Avengers film. I didn't know what Marvel was. I didn't know what Iron Man was. I didn't know Captain America. Like, I didn't know any of that. What I had been doing was going through an IMDb list of best movies of 2012 because my exams were over and I was bored. And then I came across the Avengers and it was always at the top of the list, but like I ignored it because it looked like something boys would watch. Like, it looked like it was for boys. So I was like, yeah, I don't want to watch that. But then I went through the list and watched the other stuff and I was like, you know what, let me just watch the first film on this list. And my life has never been the same again because I absolutely loved this film. I was obsessed with the first Avengers film in the summer of 2013. Like, you couldn't tell me anything. This was the best film that had ever been made. And there's a reason for that. I mean, I've already talked about the incredible casting all across the board when it comes to these main characters, so we don't even need to delve into that anymore. But then you also have just this perfect film in terms of every single scene feeling important, every single action beat moving the story forward in this like compelling way, seeing the way that these characters meet together. And again, I didn't have that experience of like, oh my god, is this character from this film and this character from this film, you know, are interacting with one another. I didn't have that experience because I didn't know that this was a whole franchise. So I was like, these characters are cool, why aren't they getting along? But it gets even better in hindsight when you realize that they were from different pockets of the same universe and they were coming together for the first time. But in terms of my initial experience, I was just so wrapped up in how compelling the story was. Like, the fact that you have this character in Loki who comes from this distant planet and he's, you know, eager to take over the world, and it's up to these Avengers who don't really get along and have like a conflict when it comes to how they would like to approach things in order to kind of save the world from Loki. It's such a simple storyline when you really think about it, but then you add in the elements of the Infinity Stones and, you know, mind control in the case of one of the heroes, Hawkeye, and that gets Black Widow invested. And then you have Mark Ruffalo's Bruce Banner making the first entry into the MCU in this film. Just seeing the way everyone gets tied into the storyline is compelling. And then you have that second part where we have our heroes together and it's time to send them out to do the job, to save the day, and they end up taking Loki in only to realize that that's exactly what he wanted. He's still in a position of power, he's still controlling the whole situation. And then at the very end you have that final act with the Chitauri just raining hell on New York, and you see the long-term implications of that in the MCU and also in, you know, some of the other MCU kind of splinter projects like Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Marvel Netflix shows. So yes, overall when it comes to the first Avengers film, I do have some strong nostalgic feelings towards it because that was the very first MCU movie that I watched. I feel like one of the reasons why I was so wrapped up in the film is because of that story just being so compelling, and of course the actors portraying these characters in such a lovable way. And on top of that, you also have this really great villain in Loki who's just deliciously evil in this film, and that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of side-eyeing the Loki Disney Plus series version of the character, because if you take a look at the first Avengers film, my guys, like, Loki is deliciously evil. I do feel like unfortunately the Disney Plus series may have lost sight of a lot of that, but that's a story for another day. And yes, when it comes to the villainy overall, people always do make fun of the Chitauri and the fact that, you know, all that needed to be done was to shoot down the ship and then all of them just kind of fell. They just kind of fell uselessly, but they still wreaked havoc on New York. Let's not forget, okay? They still did a lot of damage damage before they were taken down. They posed a threat to the Avengers. They were an Avengers level threat. Ultimately and fundamentally, I do feel like it is the character dynamics that really makes this film shine. Seeing how the relationship between these characters is evolved in this film. And yes, it is through the death of Phil Coulson, which I mentioned before didn't really affect me, and now you can see why, because I didn't really know who he was, okay? But I do feel like it worked because we'd seen him sprinkled throughout the previous films, and so it makes sense that this character that these other characters had a connection to dying would have impacted them and would have kind of refocused them to work as a team and avenge his death. And so with all of that being said, the first Avengers film is hands down the best film in phase 1 of the MCU. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my ranking of phase 1 of the MCU, it's time for you guys to let me know what your ranking of these films are down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch your videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!